Welcome, friend. And thank you for your support. You are watching Part 8. Continued from Part 7. During the days before I found Osama bin Laden for the second time. I am the man who found Osama bin Laden. My copyright statement follows. None of the materials provided in this voiceover true account of my encounter with Osama bin Laden may be used, reproduced, or transmitted, in whole or in part, in any form or by any means, electronic or mechanical, including photocopying, recording, or the use of any information storage and retrieval system, without permission in writing from me. To request such permission and for further inquiries, contact me through email. My name is Cloak, John Cloak. 001. That's right, 007 ain't got nothing on me. He is fictional. I am real. All rights reserved. This is an eyewitness account of Osama bin Laden. Life has thrust me into a world of undercover operatives, without pay. You know it's true. Since the first day we had arrived in Saudi Arabia, we had no mission. Our duty simply consisted of pulling guard duty within our unit area inside the tent cities. We received visits from a tanker truck that brought our water. We could never drink the water right away as it had to be tested for fear of Saudi Arabians poisoning it. Towards the middle of October, seemingly out of nowhere, a staff sergeant showed up, who had just arrived in the country from Fort Bragg. He was assigned a cot across from me inside our tent. The first words he ever spoke to me were, "What are you going to do when you get a divorce?" I replied, "I'm not getting a divorce." He said again, "What are you going to do when you get a divorce?" I asked him, "What are you talking about?" He repeated himself even again, "What are you going to do when you get a divorce?" I said to him, "If you know something that I don't know, just tell me." He then looked me in the eyes once again. He said, "What are you going to do when you get a divorce?" This conversation went on for 3 days. He would never say anything other than, "What are you going to do when you get a divorce?" The stress over not being able to contact my wife and not knowing if my little bubby was okay had taken its toll. Each time I tried to call home on the satellite phone in our unit area, there was no answer. Combining that with all of the disrespect from everyone in my unit on an hourly basis was pushing me over the edge. I was not only overstressed with worry about what was going on back home. I had also lost about 35 pounds from only having bread and water to eat for those first few months. Then suddenly, one day, I received a letter from my wife. It said in broken English, "If someone say, they see me run round, is true. I do, porque sí, I want you feel pain." This was it. I was now fully insane. My thought processes were swimming in all directions. I went to the battalion sergeant major and asked him to reassign me to a different battalion. He asked me why. I explained to him what had happened to me since my return from being wounded during Operation Just Cause. He went on to say that he understood, but our battalion needed to keep good people. He refused my request for transfer. Looking back, I question his motive. An hour later, the first sergeant came to me and said, "You went to the battalion sergeant major and asked for a transfer to a different battalion?" I had just been betrayed. I said, "Yes, first sergeant, I want out of this battalion as soon as possible." He said, "You sit right there. I know exactly what to do with you." 20 minutes later, he was standing in front of me saying very hatefully, "Pack your gear, You're going to Bravo Company. I've already talked to the Bravo Company commander, he's going to take good care of you. The look in his eye was that of pure evil. I packed all my gear and walked with the first sergeant over to the Bravo Company commander. There he told me what squad I would be in and pointed me into a nearby tent. Once there, I met the squad leader and the Bravo team leader that I was replacing. He was very unhappy, and so was the rest of the squad. Members of the Bravo team spoke up and said, "Why are they doing this? We are already a team. We came here as a team. Why won't they let us stay in a team?" I tried to explain to them that I had requested to be sent to a different battalion, but it was denied. Also that I was just as unhappy as they were about being forced to take over their team, pushing out their team leader. For that they hated me even more. Well, was it? The stress over everything had become too much, and I clicked. It was as if I had just come up out of that dental surgeon's chair and the dead heart he had used to spread my mouth apart, which had slipped off of my teeth and crushed into the roof of my mouth for 3.5 hours, years before. My thought process was not motivated by fear, but my desire to respond in the correct manner. I was thinking about every little thing that happened, considering each alternative, but ultimately the answers did not come from logical thinking. There were just too many variables, and my mind was fried. I walked down a few tents to talk to the chaplain. There I stood waiting for the chaplain while he talked to another soldier. Over to the right side of the tent, another soldier was on his hands and knees going through different letters in a box. He found what he was looking for and left the tent. A moment later another soldier came in and started looking through the different letters that were in that box. Still waiting for the chaplain to finish, so that I could speak to him, I was drawn to that box and that pile of letters. Once no one was looking through the letters. I walked over to it and started looking through the different letters that were there. Each one of them was addressed to any soldier. I soon picked out one and stood up. I opened it and began to read it, still waiting for the chaplain to finish what he was doing so that I could speak to him. After 30 more minutes of waiting for the chaplain, I gave up, then walked back to my new unit's tent. There I read the letter again and wrote a reply. That afternoon I put it into the outgoing mail. 2 weeks later I received a reply. In the meantime, I had gone back to the chaplain's tent and answered other letters that were sent to any soldier. I had also taken another turn on the satellite phone in our battalion area and had the information operator look up a newspaper in South Carolina. After calling the newspaper and getting the price for an ad that said, "Lonely soldier, request correspondence from a single female," I sent them a money order to pay for the ad. Then I walked into the chaplain's tent and got a handful of letters addressed to any soldier. Searched through them until I found a single woman and started writing. Soon letters started coming in, sometimes 10 per day, and saying that they were there for me and that I could write about anything that was troubling me. I soon started writing about sex, using the name of the woman I was writing to as the person who I was describing what sexual act I was performing with. Very much the same as what you would read in a Penthouse magazine letter. Soon I was corresponding with 50 or more. Always the same version of the Penthouse magazine type letter, but with names and small variations changed to fit the person I thought I was writing to. There were so many and so often that I could not keep up with who I was writing to, or who I had just written to the week before. Then one day I received a letter from 2 sisters, who said they were going to the community college and taking night courses. I returned their letter with the same version of the Penthouse magazine type letter, but with their names and small variations to fit into their being sisters. A few days later I received a reply, and they asked if I would send another letter. I did and tried to take the same short story but change it around a little. Over the next week, I continued to correspond with a now over 60 women, never sure of who I was writing to, with more and more letters arriving daily. Often, almost daily, when the mail came in from the States, I received a handful. Many people around me complained about my getting so much mail. Then I was approached by my squad leader and ordered to give him my M16 and bayonet. I did and was told to follow him to the first sergeant of Bravo Company. Inside the first sergeant tent was every high-ranking NCO of the company. I was then told that 2 sisters had received a letter from me and had taken it to their sex ed teacher at school. The sex education teacher took the letter from them and sent it to the state governor. The state governor had then sent it to my battalion commander. The same battalion commander which I had served under during Operation Just Cause in Panama. The same battalion commander who thought just leaving my Purple Heart medal on my pillow while I was asleep in the hospital was good enough for me. The same battalion commander who sent down through the chain of command my United States Army orders for my 2 Bronze Stars, Expeditionary Medal with Spearhead, and my Combat Infantryman's Badge. But never thought enough of me to have a company formation to read the orders and pin them on me. The same battalion commander, who retracted the Spearhead from my Expeditionary Medal after my morphine-induced, exaggerated value of the weapons, we confiscated out of the PDF Battalion 2000 arms room. The same battalion commander, who allowed the vicious rumors about my sniper wound to be described as friendly fire. The same battalion commander that was nowhere in sight when I had been wounded in combat. On the other hand, near any of the other soldiers in our unit who had been wounded or killed. In fact, I have no memory of him anywhere in Panama on any of the missions we went on. I had never even been within 100 meters of him. I only knew him from the many photos posted around our company building back at Fort Bragg. Next, the same Bravo company commander, which the first sergeant had come to me about and said, "You sit right there. I know exactly what to do with you." Then 20 minutes later he was standing in front of me saying very hatefully, "Pack your gear, you're going to Bravo company. I've already talked to the Bravo company commander, he's going to take good care of you," was now standing in front of me, ordering me to write a full confession. I would only write, "I wish to speak to my lawyer at this time," which made him grab his M16 and give me a look that said, "I want to kill you." Then the battalion commander had me standing in front of him inside his tent alone. I explained everything that had taken place and how it had gotten out of hand. He gave me a field-grade Article 15 under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, busted me down to E4, and took away a month's pay. His comment after giving me a field-grade Article 15 under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and taking away a month's pay, was, "I happen to know your marriage was broken long before we ever came over here." That was a startling experience to the true extent of his character. I asked him not to take my month's pay, as I was right there next to him and had no way of spending it. It was the only money my wife and son had for food. He refused, and as I walked away, he ordered me not to appeal my field-grade Article 15. As I walked outside of his tent, off to the side was the first sergeant, who had been told he was not needed during Operation Just Cause. Next to him was the S4 lieutenant, who had passed out all of his equipment, so that he could have stuffed his rucksack full with a pillow. Standing with them was the S4 ammo NCO, who was told he was not needed during Operation Just Cause, and who had worn a cast on his right fist for months after the window of my car had been busted out. Sitting down in front of them was the S4 section sergeant, who had betrayed me when I told him what the S4 lieutenant had so cowardly done, all smiling in my direction. I wondered if this was their entire fault, since they were the ones that picked up all the mail and took it to the airport, then returned with the incoming mail. My caution was not motivated by fear but by my desire to respond in the correct manner. I was thinking about every little thing that happened, considering each alternative. Had they opened and read my mail, then conspired against me? As I left the area, the S4 captain, who I was assigned to during Operation Just Cause, then came darting from around a tent, just in time to get in a smile as I walked by. I was then put in the back of the battalion sergeant major's Humvee, who I had asked weeks before for a transfer to another battalion, then betrayed, and driven for an hour and a half, where I was standing in front of another 325th Air Battalion sergeant major, given a different M16 and bayonet. I then was assigned to an airborne infantry team, this time an Alpha team but as a rifleman. There finally, I and 2 other men were taken to an American housing compound. The husband and wife that were our sponsors invited us into their home for a home-cooked meal. Before we ate, the 3 of us from my unit were allowed to take our first bath in Saudi Arabia. For me, it had been 3 months. They were so very nice to us. A week or so before Thanksgiving, while pulling a late-night perimeter guard shift, I spotted a Scud missile in flight, coming in our direction from the north. Instantly, 2 Patriot missiles, one behind the other, came across the sky in their intercept flight pattern, directly from the west. As the first Patriot missile collided and exploded with the Scud missile, the second Patriot missile kicked in its afterburners and changed directions to fly directly through the explosion. Once it went through the explosion and did not hit anything solid, it continued on until it was out of sight. Immediately, I picked up my radio microphone and contacted the E6 staff sergeant at battalion headquarters. He was a ranger and assigned to battalion CQ duty. I said, "Salute report follows." He said with a sleepy voice, "Roger out." I could not believe what I had heard. He ended the transmission by saying out. The correct response is send salute report, over. You never say out. until it is the very last and ending comment, meaning the entire conversation was over. Anything more was a new and different situation. So, I said again very loudly, salute report follows. Over. He said again, slowly and in a half-asleep voice, Roger out. By this time the explosion was all fluorescent pink smoke, and I knew the staff sergeant ranger was asleep on duty at the other end of the radio. So, I yelled, emergency salute report follows, how copy? Over? I did this in hope that he would wake up because I desperately needed to send up this information. Again, he says in a sleepy voice, Roger out. The pink fluorescent cloud of smoke was now even larger, so I donned my chemical protection mask and yelled as loud as I could, gas, gas, gas. Someone came out of a tent in the darkness and looked in my direction. So, I repeated myself while using the hand and arm signals, and yelling gas, gas, gas. He ran into his tent and came out a moment later, with his gas mask on, and started repeating my message, gas, gas, gas. Moments later, I could hear yelling from further away. The message was being relayed from soldier to soldier, gas, gas, gas. Within 1 minute the entire battalion had on their gas masks. At that point, I tried again on the radio with the ranger sleeping at his post and yelled into the microphone, gas, gas, gas. Emergency salute report follows. A Scud missile explosion in air, 1 mile to the north. Pink fluorescent smoke cloud. How copy? Over? Again, I heard his half-asleep reply, Roger out. All I could do was shake my head from side to side. As I thought of my DHG, Distinguished Honor Graduate of the NBC, Nuclear Biological Chemical Warfare School, and what good it did. When the person on the other end of the radio was asleep at his post. Driver. During the second week of November 1990, our platoon leader and platoon sergeant called formation. Once everyone was formed up, the platoon sergeant said, we have one of the new deuces and a half trucks assigned to us. We need a volunteer to drive this truck. I remained silent and so did everyone else. The platoon sergeant said, now come on, we need a volunteer, somebody speak up. Again, everyone was silent. I had been a driver for the battalion XO in the 505th years before. I had driven dump trucks and semi-tractor trailers before I came into the Army. I knew the extra hours in the motor pool, and of the extra work that comes along with being a driver of a military vehicle. So, I did not speak up, let somebody else have this. 5 minutes later, still, no one volunteered. So, I said, okay platoon sergeant, I'll do it. Shocked, and with his eyes open wide. He said very surprisedly, you? I replied, yes, platoon sergeant, I'll volunteer. I spent the next couple of days with the driver that brought us the truck. He was from a National Guard unit. Soon the day came that we were to relocate to the border of Iraq. The battalion was to be flown and then bused to the location on the border with Iraq. All trucks would be in a convoy, catching up to our unit within 48 hours. Once the deuce and a half pulled up with the National Guardsmen, of which I was to drive. My platoon leader walked up to him and said, if you let Cloak drive, I will ensure that you receive a field-grade Article 15. Surprised, the driver said, what? Again, he said, if you let Cloak drive, I will ensure that you get a field-grade Article 15. I wasn't sure what was going on. This did not make sense. They had asked for a volunteer, but no one would volunteer, so I spoke up. The driver and the lieutenant soon disappeared behind the tents, as I waited. Once the National Guardsman returned, he said, okay, get in the truck. Let's get out of here. So I loaded the truck on the passenger side, and we left the unit area and found our place within the convoy of trucks that would be headed north to the border of Iraq. 6 hours into the trip, I spoke up and asked the National Guardsman, when do you want me to take over driving so you can get some sleep? He replied, you're not driving. I said, sure I am. I'm supposed to help you drive during the trip to Iraq. He spoke up as his eyes opened wide and said, no, you're not driving. I said, you mean you're going to drive the entire 48 hours? He said, yes. I said, that's not a good idea, you need to get some sleep. He replied, sternly, you will not drive this truck. I did not want to get him into any kind of trouble, although I also knew that no one would know whether or not I drove the truck unless he told them. I did not know this man. I also did not know what he had been told when he left with the lieutenant and the platoon sergeant. I also knew that when they asked for a volunteer, no one would volunteer. So, I spoke up and said, I volunteer. Once it was me, the situation changed, and they did not need a volunteer. It was obvious that I was still being punished, or somebody had some harebrained idea about what I might do with the truck. I just don't know why, if anything, they were thinking at all. My thoughts were not motivated by fear but by my desire to respond in the correct manner to the situation at hand. I was thinking about every little thing that happened, considering each possibility, but ultimately the answers didn't come. There was just no reason for this kind of behavior. Once we made it to the border of Iraq, the driver parked the truck 1/2 mile from my unit. I spoke up and said, "You might drive up a bit closer, where I don't have to carry so much of my equipment that far." He said firmly, "No." Again, I spoke up and said, "You could just pull right up to it, and I can get out, then you could drive back." He looked me in the eye and said sternly, "No, you will walk." While I was taking down my equipment off the back of the deuce-and-a-half truck, my team leader walked up and said, "Cloak, let's go." I replied, "Okay. Just one moment, I've got to get my duffel bag down from the back of the truck." I had kept a canned ham that my aunt had sent me and some cookies from my mother. I was hoping to share them with friends on Thanksgiving Day. That, compared with the many items of equipment, made it very heavy. I did not get to share it on Thanksgiving Day but did later in the year, on Christmas morning. Still, though, no one said thank you. As I put on my rucksack and picked up my duffel bag, I said, "Lead the way, Sergeant." He took off walking, and I attempted to walk alongside him, but soon he was out far ahead of me. As my duffel bag was slowing me down because of it being heavy and my needing to drag it along the ground. When I arrived at the Foxhole, I was assigned to. My team leader had already started digging it and had already finished digging his sleep hole. Immediately, he pointed to a spot right next to his sleep hole and said, "Dig your sleep hole right there." So I did. The Foxhole. When my sleep hole was dug, I walked over to the foxhole my team leader was digging. There I sat down on the ground disgusted, and said, "Ranger, do you realize where you are?" He looked up at me and said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Look at the terrain, we are in a crater. Once you dig the foxhole down to an armpit level, and we are standing down in it, you will not be able to see very far in front of you. The outer edge of the crater is going to block your view." He looked at me and says, "Cloak, the lieutenant said to dig the foxhole right here." I replied, "Well, if we get attacked, we will not be able to see anybody coming. So, this whole fighting position is inoperable. There's no way, once you're down inside the foxhole at armpit level, that you can see more than 5 meters. Look at the foxholes, off down into the distance, going out of sight. You can see that every one of them at an armpit level are on a level with the terrain for miles. You're a ranger, didn't they teach you that terrain dictates?" He stopped what he was doing, looked at me, then looked down at the foxhole and says, "The LT said to dig here," and I did. I said, "Well, we need to move it up 5 meters to the edge of the crater." He said, "No, the lieutenant said that we are to dig it right here, so that's what we have to do. We have to dig it right here, where the lieutenant said to." "Then we need to speak to the lieutenant," I said, because he knows that terrain dictates, or should know. He was probably in a hurry and was only thinking of what he read in a book about how to put each foxhole 50 meters apart. Everyone with experience knows that 50 meters are only a guideline and that adjustments have to be made if the terrain makes the location of the foxhole useless, and here, in this crater, once down at an armpit level, you cannot see but a few meters. So, moving the foxhole up or over a few meters makes it useful, which will allow us to see an enemy long before they reach us. If not, we cannot see them until they are close enough to throw a grenade. Soon the lieutenant was walking by, so I spoke up and said, "Lieutenant, could I speak to you for a moment?" Disgustingly he says, "What is it, Cloak?" I said, "Lieutenant, sir, this foxhole is down in a crater. Once we dig it to an armpit level and get down into it, we cannot see more than a few meters in front of the foxhole. That makes this foxhole inoperable." Wow, he was so angry. The lieutenant says, "Cloak, I stepped off this lazy W for every foxhole in our unit. The measurements put this foxhole right here." I said, "Yes, Lieutenant, I understand that, but in the book you read, when putting up a perimeter of foxholes, and you step out your lazy W with a foxhole is every 50 meters, terrain dictates whether or not to move the position, right or left, forward or back a few meters." He interrupted me and said, "Cloak, the foxhole is going right here." I spoke up and said, "Lieutenant, sir, with all due respect, if you'll just get down here for a minute into this foxhole, you will see what I'm talking about. I can only see a few meters in front of me. We need to move this position a few meters to the edge of the crater, and dig down to an armpit level so that we are looking over the edge of the crater instead of looking at the outer wall of the crater. Only then can we be useful to the fighting positions to our left and the fighting positions to our right if we are attacked. If not, and we are attacked, we have to stay down inside the crater, waiting for the enemy to get so close that they could throw a grenade. And, because we're down in the very bottom of this crater, A grenade just keeps rolling and rolling towards the bottom, which is where we are. The lieutenant spoke up and says, "Cloak, I don't want to hear anything more about it. This is where the foxhole is going to be dug, and you're going to dig it." He then left. Disgustingly, I turned towards the ranger and said, "The only way we can make this foxhole of any use is to not dig any deeper than we are right now. What we have to do is build up the sides of the walls, up to where they are at armpit level. This is, as you can see, with me standing in the bottom of this foxhole, as deep as we dug it. Right now, this is at an armpit level. Pointing my arm straight out as if it were my M16, just barely points over the top of the outer edge of the crater. It's only from the standing position I'm in right now that we could shoot at anyone approaching us if they are an enemy, and they are more than 5 meters from us. If not, and we keep digging down further, and we get down in that foxhole during the fight, we cannot see anybody more than 5 meters from us, which means we will have to get out of the foxhole and walk to the edge of the crater. Then use the front edge of the crater while we lie down and return fire. Only then will we be able to see who is really there." We spent the next week building the outer edge of that foxhole up with small rocks we could find lying around in the desert, and then pushed sand up to it, trying to fill up the area inside that crater immediately around our foxhole. Then one day, the lieutenant walked by and says, "What are you doing, Cloak?" I explained. This totally ticked him off. He ordered us to stop, so we did. I had run into this type of stupidity before. A lieutenant would spend a few weeks reading books. Then they would go to airborne school, where they would get 5 jumps. Then they come to a unit inside the 82nd Airborne and refuse to listen to anybody that had more experience than they had, because the person explaining the situation to them had a lower rank than they had, and it didn't matter if it was an E9 with 20 years of experience or not. I was clearly an unwanted, unappreciated combat wounded veteran with 7 years of military experience against his 1 year. The small handheld radio I received in a box sent from home, which my mother had put in it for me, and a set of small earphones. I could not get it to work. It would not pick up anything. I walked over to my sleep hole and stepped up on the pile of dirt beside it. I put the small radio in my right hand and starched it up toward the heavens as far as I could. It suddenly almost picked up a sound. As I turned my hand from side to side, trying to catch the radio waves of Radio Free Europe, the sound of George Strait singing "Love Without End, Amen" came through and filled my eyes with tears. I missed my little bubby so very badly. 4 weeks later, we were allowed one by one to go into the only army tent near our location and take a standing bath next to a bucket of water. That was the second and last bath I was allowed to take during Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield. The only lieutenant I had ever worked under who did not act this way did graduate from West Point. He said, "When the shit starts rolling downhill, it stops on me. I will not let it find its way to you." And he never did. Be ready for Part 9. We're getting much closer to the history-making salute report that pinpointed the location and activity of Osama bin Laden. I seen him with my own eyes. I am the eyewitness. I will no longer stay silent. My name is Cloak, John Cloak. 001.